It's good to be back in California. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. I took the midnight train from Georgia. Why are we here for a second conference on the Exodus? Bill Propp wrote in his irreplaceable, unmatched commentary on Exodus in the Anchor Bible, "It is the most important story in the Bible." Bill Propp wrote Rashi in the first major medieval commentary on the Torah, the first Hebrew book to be done on the printing press. In his very first comment on the first verse, asked, why didn't the Torah in fact start with this, the Exodus, instead of with creation? In the oldest version of the Ten Commandments, in Exodus 34, the holiday commemorating at Passover is in 2 of the 10. And in the other 2 versions, in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, it's the opening premise of the whole 10. I am Yahweh who brought you out of the land of Egypt from a house of slaves. In the Torah, each year is reckoned to start with the month commemorating it. The holiday that celebrates it in that month, Passover, is the most inextricably, foundationally embedded in Christianity. The first full moon of spring shines on its first night of celebration every year. It requires that for 1 week every year, all the people of Israel live like priests, doing a home sacrifice and not eating leaven. A huge conference of 48 papers wasn't enough to come to terms with it. So here we are again, with 30 more efforts to understand and appreciate this thing. The story, the event behind the story, the expansions and misreadings of the story. Albright showed the need to merge both archaeology and biblical research back in the first half of the 20th century. His successor, my teacher, G.E. Wright, carried it on by both digging and theologizing into the 1970s. And the 2 programs with which I've been associated, here at the University of California, San Diego, and the University of Georgia, both carried on the tradition along with other schools by bringing, though we did it the best, by bringing together these 2 components of the field and adding some new ones, literary, anthropological, linguistic, genetic, and more. I regard these 2 transdisciplinary conferences on the Exodus as a pinnacle of this merger. The Exodus is more than just a good test case. It is the starting point, as our colleague Bill Propp said, the most important story in the Hebrew Bible. It is the subject of the oldest text in the Bible, the Song of the Sea. As I argued in my book on the Exodus that followed our first conference, it led to the most significant theological development, monotheism, and the most profound ethical concept, the love of neighbor, including the alien, especially the alien, as oneself. Some of those who specialize in just text or just archaeology have been slow to catch on to this development, the merging of the 2, just when we were really getting somewhere with it. Our field was on its path to its holy grail. We came a long way and were truly close. How did this happen? Because we followed the trail of those who came before us. We built on a century of research, correcting the errors, refining what was close, exposing the mistakes. German, English, American, Israeli, Norwegian, Japanese scholars all listening to each other and contributing to the solution. I had turned to source criticism to help solve the Exodus, but it turned out that the Exodus connection rewarded us by bringing us closer than ever to solving the source-critical problem of the Torah. And one of the best expressions of this arrival was that first Exodus conference. In the place of arguing about whether a source was J or E because of which word it used for a maid, we were able to judge why the sources mattered. They are the key to uncovering the Exodus, the origin of the theological revolution of monotheism, and the ethical revolution of love of even the alien. And then, as if with a wicked laugh from the Satan, our field raised tens of impediments, all poorly defended, methodologically undefended. They propose new models without regarding the long-established ones. They use the word literary without being experienced in literary studies. They confuse consensus with evidence as if consensus proved anything. They make judgments based on archaeological finds or the absence of them without reconciling their conclusions with our largest source of evidence, which is the text and the history that we can deduce from it through competent historical method. They write literary treatments of biblical stories without understanding what we know archaeologically of the settings of those stories. Our field moves slowly. In the 1950s and 1960s, we wrote histories without being trained as historians. In the 1970s and onward, we wrote literary works without being trained in literature. Meanwhile, novelists, literary scholars, geologists, and anthropologists all wrote about our field without being trained in Bible. Next will be AI, then we all won't have to be trained in anything. People speak of a continental divide between North American and European scholarship, with the United Kingdom and Israel counting as North American. But the only divide is among those who don't read each other. Several ignored the evidence and reasoning that I assembled since Who Wrote the Bible in 1987, which would have undermined their claims, commonly ignoring the entire book, except to mention that in an early edition I had proposed that Jeremiah might have been the Deuteronomist, a view that has not appeared in the book's later editions for the last 30 years. And then what has been the most common criticism of Who Wrote the Bible? That I didn't respond to them. I'm getting all this off my chest today, okay? I'm 79. You can color your hair, but you can't fool your prostate. Regarding the hypotheses coming out of German scholarship, especially following Ralph Rentdorf, I published Who Wrote the Bible in 3 German editions and in French, Italian, Spanish, Russian, and Turkish, as well as Japanese and Hebrew. And I had public debate with Erhard Bloom at the SPL 30 years ago. But the repeated response I got whenever I would bump into Ralph was, "Ah, Friedman, you still believe in Wellhausen." Even though Klaus Balzer was on my doctoral committee, even though I'd made my way to Heidelberg where Helga Weipert opened her door with the greeting, "Are you the Friedman who wrote about the Deuteronomist?" people still speak of the focus on the continental divide. And even though the determining work about linguistic dating of the biblical texts came from a collaboration of a European scholar and an American scholar, Jan Houston and Ron Hendel, who's here, and this confirmed work by an Israeli scholar, Avi Hurwitz, numerous late daters on both sides of the Atlantic continue to assert the texts are post-exilic without so much as a footnote to let their readers know that maybe, just maybe, that is linguistically impossible. And it's not just linguistic. For all these colleagues who think that much or all of the Torah was post-exilic, the tabernacle was associated only with the Shiloh temple and the first Jerusalem temple. Why would anyone in post-exilic time, when the tabernacle was destroyed and long gone, write texts that say that there's only one place on earth where people can do sacrifices, and that one place was where? The tabernacle. Why would they write a Torah in which there is more about the tabernacle than any other subject? Why did they write that you couldn't eat meat unless you sacrificed the animal at the Petach Ohel Moed at a time when by anybody's reckoning there was no Petach and no Ohel Moed? Do we imagine that they were requiring all Jews forever to be vegetarian? My paper at our first Exodus conference and my book on the Exodus that treated the evidence more fully made the case that the classic identification of the sources of the Torah provided the best evidence of who was in the Exodus and why it mattered. For those of you who do not have that interest or that area of expertise, that's fine. Proceed to make whatever contributions you have in your particular fields, but recognize that the pieces of the puzzle that you bring must at some point be reconciled with the evidence from the textual sources in order to be useful. Distinguishing between the Levite sources, E, P, and D, and the non-Levite source, J, revealed 52 references to the treatment of the alien, all of the references to slavery, all of the narratives of the plagues, all in the Levite sources, none in J. All of this is lost in the form-critical and supplementary hypotheses. As I've written before, the demonstrable continuity of the sources is contrary to all supplementary hypotheses. The issue is not a continental divide, it's the dividing of coherent prose works into little pieces. The problem is not that we believe in Wellhausen. We don't. The problem is that we believe in evidence. My work, that comes from being at UCSD, where all my colleagues were scientists, and I go, oh, evidence. My work on the Exodus traced our sources to specific authors in specific periods. This followed on several of my works that identified the unique artistry and vocabulary of the biblical writers, chains of puns, ironic compensants for offenses by the story's heroes and heroines, storylines built on continuing plot elements as identifiably developed as in a novel by Kundera or Stendhal or Michael Chabon or Ellis Hoffman. Allusion, paronomasia, continuity, recurring themes with variation, all of the elements that make the artistry of exceptional individual authors. As I've said, the continuity of the sources alone is contrary to all supplementary and fragmentary hypotheses. But now we have another kind of challenge to those authors' continuity. Some scholars in our field make the claim that there were no such authors. Rather, they say there were groups of anonymous scribes. Lately, there have been some long overdue attention to scribal practice in those times. The best treatments I've seen are by my student Tyler Kelly in Georgia in an important dissertation, and by Bill Schniedewind at UCLA. The notion of tracing authorship to a community of scribes owes initially and most prominently to Moshe Weinfeld, of blessed memory, whose book Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomy School was a landmark in our field, followed by his Anchor Bible Deuteronomy commentary and his entry on Deuteronomy in the Anchor Bible Dictionary. Andrew Dearman likewise developed this view of the scribe's role. He wrote, "The story of the making of the Bible is the story of the scribes behind the Bible." Recently, it has figured in books by Bill Schniedewind and Jacob Wright. I especially want to respond to Schniedewind and respectfully because he's here. Are you here? He's here. Good. And he's a learned scholar. In a book with the intriguing title, Who Really Wrote the Bible? Without a question mark at the end. The third book to use this title, Bill goes beyond Weinfeld's scribes to Deuteronomy and sees scribal communities more pervasively in the Bible. He doesn't treat any of the evidence that I brought in Who Wrote the Bible and 3 subsequent books, and most recently and particularly for this particular present gathering, in my book, The Exodus, evidence that there were individual, datable authors of the Torah and the Deuteronomistic history, which is the view that he is challenging. In a particularly sweeping generalization, Bill says that the very idea of authors is anachronistic, post-Hellenistic, and he references Homer, Herodotus, Plato, and Aristotle. If we respond that Isaiah is identified as an author, in the first words of his book, Schniedewind says, no, it doesn't say that Isaiah wrote that vision. Rather, visions ascribed to him were written down by others. But Homer doesn't say that he wrote the Iliad or the Odyssey, but rather attributes them to a muse. And Plato didn't claim to write Plato. He attributed the Republic and the Dialogues to Socrates, who didn't write anything. Aristotle comes the closest to authorship, but most of his surviving works were teachings of his that were collected and written down by others, like Isaiah. As for the historians, Herodotus does say that he wrote his researches. True. So does Hecataeus. Still, when we sponsored a conference on this very question, right here at UCSD 43 years ago, and I drew a distinction between the biblical authors and the Greek historians, the leading classical historian of the century, Arnaldo Mimiliano, was here, and he corrected and instructed me and said that there was no difference between the two, the Greek and the biblical, at all. As a young whippersnapper, I disputed with the great Mimiliano using the very argument that Bill Schniedewind made about the Greek historians' self-identification by name, but he dismissed the idea that this was even a consequential difference. In the ancient Near East, on the other hand, the first work attributed to an author by name was by Enhedu Anna in the first half of the 3rd millennium BCE. The first known named work by an individual on Earth, then, was composed by that daughter of Sargon in Mesopotamia over a millennium before Homer's great-grandmother was in preschool. As I've said, my whole case on the Exodus was based on our ability to identify specific individual authors in ancient Israel as well. I began my paper at our first Exodus conference with the statement that I still hold, that the written sources that gave us the story of the Exodus in the first place still provide us with our best evidence on this subject. Schniedewind, Jacob Wright, Israel Knoll, and others attribute more and more of the Bible to unknown scribes and scribal schools. But there are few cases in the history of the world of scribes composing literature. Tyler Kelly and I both came to recognize that writers and scribes are not just professionally distinct. They are two different kinds of human beings. Scribes copy texts. They rarely write them. I've known a couple of scribes. They weren't authors or poets. I think the only thing they could do besides their scribal job was maybe to raise chickens. That way they could at least use the feathers as quills. And I've known hundreds of writers, and not one of them has worked as a scribe. One might respond that since the advances from the printing press to the computer, we have much less need for the scribal profession now. But actually, that's not true of Hebrew scribes. It's estimated that scribes still write 100 new scrolls of the Torah every year, and it can take a trained scribe up to a year and a half to do one. But few of these persons write bestsellers. Scribes who write literature, fiction or nonfiction, prose or poetry, are rare. The same may go for scholars, who are the closest to the mindset of scribes in our world. Part of what made Wellhausen successful, even though so much of what he wrote was a synthesis of other scholars before him, was that Wellhausen could write with style. Wellhausen dedicated his work to his colleague, the classicist Wilemovich, but Wilemovich didn't share Wellhausen's appreciation of good writing, as demonstrated by his ill-fated attempt to challenge Nietzsche, who was a real literary stylist of German, and soon after this had his Zarathustra say, "I left the house of the scholars." And Zarathustra added, "Thus they knit the socks of the spirit." Also wirken sie die Stümpfe des Geistes. Who are the scribes whose names are well known from the Bible? Baruch ben Neriah and Ezra. I've considered myself that Baruch may be the Deuteronomist. If that's so, then he's the only biblical writer who is also known to be a scribe, which ironically brings us back to Weinfeld. Not the author of J, or the court history, or Samuel A, or Samuel B, or any of the 15 books of the prophets, or any of the 150 Psalms, or E, or DTN, or even P, or the Song of Miriam, or the Song of Deborah, or the Blessing of Jacob, or the Blessing of Moses, or Ruth, or Esther, or Daniel, or Ecclesiastes. Do you read Job or any of these and say, that sounds like a scribe? Do you read the prose that extends from J to the end of the court history in 1 Kings 2 with its hundreds of connecting puns and continuous plot elements and say, that sounds like a group project of many anonymous scribes? Listen, not for philosophy does this rose give a damn, but while you and I have lips and voices, which are for kissing and to sing with, who cares if some one-eyed son of a bitch invents an instrument to measure spring with? Why then, to hell with that, the other, this, since the thing perhaps is to eat flowers and not to be afraid. Do you think that this was written by a scribe or by E.E. Cummings? And if you say that that's different because it's a modern work, then try this. Tamar took the pancakes and brought them to Amnon, her brother. And he grabbed her and said, "Come lie with me, my sister." And she said, "Don't, my brother, don't degrade me. Where would I bear my disgrace? Speak to the king, because he won't hold me back from you." But he wasn't willing to listen to her, and he overpowered her, and he degraded her, and he laid her. And Amnon felt a big hatred for her, so that the hatred that he hated her was bigger than the love that he had loved her. And Amnon said, "Get up, go." And she said, "Don't. This bad thing to send me away is worse than the other thing that you did to me." And he wasn't willing to listen to her. He called his boy and said, "Send this one away from me, outside, and lock the door behind her." And Tamar put ashes on her head and ripped the coat of many colors that she had on and put her hand to her head and went on, screaming. Do you think that this sounds like a scribe or a school of scribes? Do you really believe in group authors of prose and of poetry? I've co-authored with a single colleague 4 different times in my career. It's difficult. In one case, it undermined a friendship. but co-authoring with a multi-generational professional society, not an edited collection like a Festschrift or the volume that will come out of this meeting, a real co-authored work. In what reality does that happen? The closest is probably Dumas, who used to outline his novels and then assign chapters to his students. But that was in a single generation. It was signed by Dumas, and all the students already knew how to write in French, and no one would characterize him or them as scribes. Scribes don't write literature, especially great literature. And if we grant that a couple of exceptional scribes could have written or the court history, still can we allow for 100 exceptions to the prose and poetic works of the Hebrew Bible? Scribes write records, they write correspondence, they make copies. Bill Schniedewind writes about the Amarna scribes. Military, logistical, and political issues dominate the correspondence of these scribes. They don't write Exodus. I understand that some scholars take their cue from the fact that no biblical authors signed their works with a name. Bill wrote this is almost certainly because it was collected and produced by communities. Really? But where do we authors today reveal our names? On the book cover or in the separate page known as the front matter? The biblical authors didn't have books with covers, let alone front matter. Take away the cover and front matter of my books or your own, and they'll be as unsigned as Exodus or Ruth. I want to recognize that Bill's is an erudite treatment of scribal communities, but there's no smoking stylus to prove that scribes actually did it, and no refutation of all the evidence that they didn't, but that it was rather identifiable individual brilliant authors. Jacob Wright, meanwhile, claiming to tell us in a book called How the Bible Began, wrote that we in the field only addressed who and not why the authors wrote. And he gave my Who Wrote the Bible as an example. Actually, Who Wrote the Bible is almost entirely about the why, and my work on the Exodus book that came further produced it even more. Tracing the two most basic elements of the Torah, monotheism and the love of the alien, to the experience of the Levites who lived through the Exodus and the life of aliens. Wright apparently couldn't get past the word who in the title of the book, and missed the other 99%, as well as all of my works that followed it. Obsessed with that who, he mentioned only the Jeremiah identification that I raised at first, but which doesn't appear in the second and third editions of the book. Following the European model, Wright pictured his anonymous scribes writing pre-exilic Hebrew in post-exilic times. He pictured them writing with a political agenda for the Jewish community following the Babylonian destruction. He claimed it was a very small community of scribes writing for themselves who undertook to create a collective identity around the text that they created. They had this vision that there could be a reading public and that the texts could be the foundation of a political community. Yes, that's why they left the name Israel out of the Song of the Sea, to create a collective identity for Israel. That's why they left the Levites and the Judeans out of the Song of Deborah, to create a collective identity for Judah. That's why they had David expose his nudity in front of the ark, to create a foundation of a political community. In 2 Samuel, the author of the court history does more to create an Oedipal identity than a political one. I'm a Freudian, I had to get that in. Wright treats Israel as a small, barely significant political entity. The way our colleagues in physics would describe that view, in the words of Wolfgang Pauli, that's not even wrong. Das ist nicht einmal falsch. Israel sat then, as it does now, at the point where the three great continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa, meet. It had control of the land trade. It sat on the Mediterranean Sea, the Sea of Galilee, the Red Sea, the Dead Sea, and the Jordan River. It had copper and iron. It was fertile. It had political ties to the Phoenicians, the Philistines, Aram, Moab, Edom, and the nomadic land to the southeast, and Egypt to the southwest. It had the great new invention, the alphabet. It had 15 pre-exilic kings who are mentioned in the archaeological record of their neighbors and their own, and all in the right period. Meanwhile, our colleagues among geneticists showed that the Levites who gave us the story of the Exodus were genetically different from the rest of Israel. They came from somewhere else. That made sense in the Exodus generation and those that followed it, especially if we accept that the Levites came from Egypt and then joined Israel. But how can we account for this among post-exilic scribes who had 600 or 700 years of marriage with others in Israel? And what of that linguistic evidence that all of the sources of the Torah were written in classical pre-exilic Hebrew? Wright didn't mention it. At our first conference, Christoph Berner summarized the rejection of the documentary analysis among European scholars in a mere couple of sentences. Still, he was doing respectably until he too said that the priestly source was post-exilic. Our field has been fighting a battle for 2 centuries about this frankly ridiculous idea of post-exilic composition of much of the Hebrew Bible, born out of Wellhausen's anti-Semitism and anti-Catholicism. Moshe Weinfeld, Ron Hendel, and I have expressed our skepticism of what an unlikely historical scenario that view imagines, that the Jews produced next to nothing literary or historical or theological while they were in their lands for 600 years. But suddenly, after they were thrown out of their land, they produced monotheism, the Sabbath, history, great literature, and a political community. As John Cleese of Monty Python would summarize this, nonsense. It's historically improbable and linguistically impossible. Our field seems to have an instinctive resistance to progress. Just when we were getting close to identifying the dates and authors of the priestly source in the Torah, my friends Israel Knoll and Jacob Milgram both promoted a model of texts being written by 2 schools of writers, the holiness school and the priestly school, more anonymous scribes spread out over generations. They tore the priestly source in half and spread the pieces out over centuries with yet another model of group authorship. How did this view start? Knowles began with an argument from consensus. He wrote, "Scholars generally agree that Numbers, chapters 28 and 29, is holy PT. That stands for priestly Torah, his term for P. And then he showed that this priestly holiday text in Numbers 28 and 29 was not in sync with the Holiness Code holiday text in Leviticus. It was an argument from consensus, what scholars generally agree. I love democracy, but truth is not democratic. Truth is not determined by a majority vote. Consensus is interesting, but never a proof of anything. The consensus was once that the sun went around the earth, that evolution was false, and that Moses wrote the Torah. But in any case, was Knoll right? Did scholars generally agree that Numbers 28 and 29 is holy P? The 2 best known identifications of all the passages in the Torah by source at that time were Martin Note's Überlieferungsgeschichte des Pentateuch and my Who Wrote the Bible. Neither Note nor I said that these chapters were P. Neither did the standard text preceding us by Carpenter and Harford Battersby. Neither did Driver. Neither did Georg Forer in Einleitungen das Alte Testament. I don't know which was more injurious, that Knoll used consensus as the starting premise or that he had the consensus precisely backwards. Knoll, followed by Jack Milgram and half of our field, then went on to build a mountain of scholarship and publications out of this faulty molehill. I'm going to get passionate here. But it's for good reasons. The first is that I'm at an age where it's okay, even expected, to be a curmudgeon. But second, because I'm so put off by what these colleagues have done. What we accomplished in our generation, above all, which was on display at our first conference, and in my case, in my published work that followed it, was to arrive at the strongest, most fruitful demonstration of what we can achieve when we merge archaeological and historical study with biblical scholarship. The same goes for Propp's 2-volume Exodus, which is a monument among biblical commentaries, and it goes for the work of Hendel, Houston, and Tigay and works that I'm citing. I'm not quite done. Just at this culminating moment in our understanding, neo-documentarian writers abandoned history. They stated explicitly as a matter of method that they did this on purpose, that they could treat the Torah's sources only by the textual account. Their most visible spokesman, Joel Baden, put it for them. He said, "In the neo-documentary hypothesis, the absolute dating of the sources is not a topic of investigation. If all 4 were written within 20 years of each other, the literary evidence would not change. If J were written in the 10th century and P in the Middle Ages, The literary evidence would not change. The dating of the sources has no impact on the neo-documentary hypothesis. How did they justify this? They said, it is the literary solution to a literary problem, no more or less. This was troubling, coming from scholars who had so little in the way of literary credentials and skills in their training, as described in their public profiles, and so little evidence of it in their published writings. That would be bad enough, but they in fact did not understand what literary means. The documentary authorship and sources question is not, in fact, a literary problem. It is a problem of literary history. The difference between literature and literary history is as determinative as the distinction between art and art history, or between music and music history. Everybody understands the distinction in the art history case. Even our freshmen learn that those are two different things. And this is more than a matter of terminology. By not recognizing that this was a matter of literary history, they missed out on the history half of what we do. Speaking as a professor of Hebrew and comparative literature for 30 years at UCSD, while still being a student of G.E. Wright, a colleague of Tom Levy, a contributor to Israel Finkelstein's video of the Bible Unearthed, and one who got dirty in the City of David excavations for years with Yigal Shiloh. That's a lie, I never got dirty. My students got dirty. I'm grieved to see colleagues undermine everything that we've accomplished through their inability to come to terms with this natural collaborative outcome our field after these recent decades of cooperative collegial work in literary, history, and archaeology. Our colleague Ron Hendel has taught that it's all about historical memory. So I guess to these neo-scholars, it's about amnesia. What then can one say about this neo-documentary hypothesis? Das ist nicht einmal falsch. It's not even wrong. This limited group have actually claimed that they have come to rescue or renew the documentary hypothesis when they didn't understand that the hypothesis, they didn't understand the hypothesis and didn't recognize that it didn't need rescuing. And they, in fact, rather undermined it, doing the same thing that its opponents did. They introduced a new model without responding to the evidence that made the documentary hypothesis so long-lasting. What do they think they are rescuing? Who at the Bible has been the best-selling, this is going to get a little egotistical here. Who at the Bible has been the best-selling book since 1987, the most cited, the most quoted, the most assigned, the most translated? 3 million anchor Bible volumes, including the documentary hypothesis in all of the volumes on the Pentateuch, have been published. Add hundreds of online lectures and courses viewed by thousands, polychrome Bibles on the web and in print, the two deans of American scholarship, Frank Moore Cross, and his influential books, and his 100 PhD students, every one of whom got a tenure-track job, David Noel Friedman and his millions of authored and edited volumes constituting the second longest entry in Who's Who in the world, a plethora of distinguished scholars at Oxford and Cambridge and Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, the hypothesis assigned and at least discussed in practically every university and seminary course, hundreds of papers and lectures in leading journals and at the Society of Biblical Literature, the American Schools of Oriental Research, the Association for Jewish Studies, the Catholic Biblical Association, and the Biblical Archaeology Society, among others. The problem isn't that the neo-scholars oppose all this, it's that they don't know it. Their intellectual Dr. Vater, Baruch Schwartz, proposed a project of creating an online, color-coded text of the biblical sources, unaware that this already exists online in the Westminster Leningrad Codex. Leanne Feldman published a translation of the priestly text, which she said had never been translated separately before, unaware that this already existed in my book, The Bible with Sources Revealed, which had not only the priestly text, but all of the Torah's source texts, each translated independently and then joined in distinct colors so one could read them individually, independently, or together. Jeff Stackert, a neo-scholar at Chicago, wrote, quote, adherents of the neo-approach join in the recent critique of Graf Wellhausen and their heirs all the way down through Martin Note, Frank Moore Cross, and Richard Elliott Friedman. I like and respect Stackert, but the one thing that Note, Cross, and I have in common in this matter is that we all undermined Wellhausen, each on different grounds. Joel Baden wrote in a book titled Source Criticism that left out all of this American scholarship, jumping from German scholarship to his own neo-documentary rescue from it in the last chapter. As the humorist Dave Barry would say, I am not making this up. His history of the field is a fantasy land, pretending that a world of scholarship doesn't exist while culminating in Schwartz and himself. And Baden gave us the literary solution for the literary problem, Mishigas, unresponsive to the entirety of literary historical scholarship. Baruch Schwartz came out here to San Diego to present his new model to our seminar at UCSD a couple of decades ago. When he left, Noel Friedman, Bill Propp, and I all looked at each other and said almost simultaneously, he doesn't understand redaction. And then possibly the biggest innovation of the NEO model was redaction. They claimed that only one redactor compiled the whole Torah. Stackert wrote, it's one of the hallmarks of neo-documentarian scholarship. That was opposed to our understanding that one redactor first combined the texts known as J and E. Neither of those two sources reads as a complete text, but this redactor, RJE, combined them so that they now do read together as an unbroken whole. As Sigmund Mowinckel in Norway and I found independently, the priestly text, P, was written as an alternative to that already combined text, that combined work. A second redactor, R, later edited those two complete works, RJE and P, together. Now, what is the big deal about the neo-reduction of those two stages of redaction into one? Susan Neidich, in an important and well-known book, had questioned the entire documentary hypothesis 30 years ago. She questioned how exactly it was supposed to be accomplished. Does a redactor have 4 manuscripts in front of him on the biggest table in all of Judah, and he finds and selects the needed passages in each of them and edits them together? Or does he have 4 assistants reading each of them aloud while he keeps stopping them to copy and edit them together? Her common sense argument about the failure of scholars to picture the process that was essential to the hypothesis was strong enough that David Carr reproduced it verbatim with approval in one of his books. I too have reproduced it verbatim, now with approval, produced it verbatim in my foreword to Jeffrey Tigay's volume, Empirical Models for Biblical Criticism. But I rejected Susan's argument on the grounds that the hypothesis never requires more than just 2 texts at a time being combined. J and E are redacted together by RJE. The RJE text is redacted together with P by the final redactor. That was doable. And that was my answer to Susan. But what are these neo-documentarians? What is their answer to Susan? The oldest traditional scholarly answer known: silence. Neidich's point is potentially a deal breaker for their hypothesis, but they never mention it, even to argue against it. At the end of Baden's chapter on compilation, he says, now that we have addressed the literary question of what the compiler did and how he did it, but no, he never addressed how he did it or understood that the essential point of how he did it, the mechanics of redacting, not compiling, multiple long, heavy, handwritten scrolls, was left unaddressed. He enlisted the name of Menachem Haran, who was Schwartz's teacher, in service of this fantasy version of the field. But Menachem, who was my friend and colleague and visiting professor here at UCSD, and also we were together at Oxford, was deeply interested in scroll length and what they were capable of housing. And I don't see much in his work in which he and I were in basic agreement against my own teacher, Cross, that looks remotely neo. Besides everything else that is faulty about the neo-documentary idea, it suffers from redaction reduction. Baden wrote, redaction reduction. He wrote, the analysis must begin with the identification of and isolation of the sources before any investigation of how they are put together can proceed. There obviously can be no accurate evaluation of how the sources were combined before we have a full picture of what texts each of the sources comprises. No. First, anytime the word obviously occurs in scholarship, it's wrong. And second, the process of identifying the sources and the redaction is dialectical. Any serious research moves with simultaneous awareness of both. Finding the redacted sources only before coming to terms with the redaction is childlike, stuck like beginners in the earliest entry into this subject. I'm grateful to these scholars for joining me in showing what's wrong in the German post-Rentorf scholarship, and I've helped and praised them for it, but their own solution is no better. It's like some recent Orthodox Jewish scholarship that has observed inconsistency and repetition in the ancient Near Eastern texts and think that that somehow challenges the documentary hypothesis, even though I listed the 7 major groups of evidence for the hypothesis in my book, The Bible with Sources Revealed, and inconsistency and repetition were not among them. Not to mention that the ancient Near Eastern examples are in poetry, and the documentary hypothesis is about prose. Thus, like the neos, they think they've refuted a hypothesis, which they actually don't know, and they just don't know the hypothesis. So, do you see why I criticized consensus? All of these methodologically challenged individuals and groups, each going their own way, and not knowing the power. Don't you want to know what? And not knowing the power of the original hypothesis that they say has lost consensus. That hypothesis may not have unanimity, or a majority, or a plurality, but as my teacher, G.E. Wright, used to say, so what? It has evidence, it has texts, it has artifacts, it has reason, and it has cumulative mutual support of at least 7 different kinds of verification, which were all listed in The Bible with Sources Revealed 22 years ago. And the alternatives are insufficiently defended and poorly informed. Now, what is the relevance of all of this to the Exodus? Remember, it was a conference about the Exodus. I made a case in the first conference and in my book on the Exodus that our identification of the sources of the biblical account are our best path to the solution of the Exodus question. It is the Levite sources of the Torah, E, P, and D, that provide that path. Only the Levites and their associates have Egyptian names. In our 2 oldest sources, the Song of Deborah leaves out the Levites from the original Israel, while the Song of the Sea, meanwhile, leaves out any mention of Israel. The Levites' priestly tabernacle matched the structure of the Egyptian tent of Ramses II, as shown by our student Michael Homan, whom we sadly lost since our last meeting, and whose memory is a blessing. The Levites' ark matched the structure of the Egyptian barks, as shown at our first Exodus conference by Scott Nogel. Only the Levite sources, E and P, taught that Yahweh first revealed his name to Moses, reflecting the historical experience of the arrival of the Yahweh-worshiping Levite group in Israel after the Exodus and the merger of those arriving immigrants with the El-worshiping population of Israel, thus accounting for the most famous clue to the documentary hypothesis, the divine name. Gary Rensburg and Baruch Halpern collected at least 10 more known items of Egyptian literature and culture that surface in the Exodus story, and every one of them occurs in the Levite sources E and P, and none occurs in the non-Levite source text J. Only the Levite sources E, P, and D mention aliens, 50 times no less. Only the Levite sources E, P, and D have laws about slaves. The new science of genetics further substantiated this. People were intrigued when they learned that Kohanim, to this day among the Jewish communities, have a genetic commonality. But while this applies to that Kohen subgroup of the Levites, the geneticist Karl Skorecki and his colleagues found that Levites have no such common genetic profile. That is consistent with the historical picture that the Levites were the ones in Egypt who made the Exodus and immigrated to Israel, perhaps with a stop in Midian along the way, and took up their role as clergy rather than receiving territory. They weren't a family or a clan or a tribe. They don't have common DNA. They have common history. So here we are at a conference whose first volume is titled The Exodus in Transdisciplinary Perspective. Transdisciplinary. You, from all your different disciplines, are here as colleagues. Those of you with expertise in literature know the difference between Dostoevsky and a scribe. You know that no scribes could have written The Brothers Karamazov, or Hamlet, or Slaughterhouse-Five, or for that matter, Harry Potter, or for that matter, Exodus. Those of you who know archaeology know that all those items of Egyptian culture in the Bible's Levite sources can shed light on both the Exodus and the documentary hypothesis. Those of you who know genetics know that the common profile of the Kohen gene, when compared to the completely disparate profile of the Levite gene, must reveal something about the history of those entities and why they each told the story of the Exodus in their own way. Those of you who know linguistics know that we cannot ignore the ever-refining evidence that all of the sources of the Torah were written in pre-exilic classical Hebrew before the Babylonian event. And all of you who know methodology know that you don't find your theory first and then go seeking evidence and arguments to back it up. You start with the study of the evidence and then naturally follow the trail from that to your theory. But in our methodologically hamstrung field, we have given new academic meaning to the phrase snail's pace. Perhaps because our sites and our texts are over 2 millennia old, we have felt like that woman in Seinfeld who eats her peas one at a time and says, "What's the rush?" But from my point of view, it is lamentable that in 2025 CE, we are still being held back by those who don't know who gave us the Bible or why, and who simply refuse to respond to evidence in the ground, in the text, and in their colleagues' work. So I'm casting a wide methodological net here, but here are my own sweeping generalizations. Everybody who traces the Torah to groups of unknown scribes or schools is unrealistic. Everybody who traces it to the post-exilic period just plain doesn't know Hebrew. Everyone who proposes a new model without coming to terms with all the evidence for the model that they're rejecting, to use an old phrase of Wellhausen's, requires no particular refutation. When the Bible commanded to make fringes, it meant on our clothes, not on our theories. I'd hoped you'd like that. My hope for this international conference is that it is the beginning of the end of the tohu vavohu, a return to the responsible progression in text and archaeology, which was so rudely and unjustifiably interrupted in our generation. My wish is that every one of you in your papers in this conference will take your place in this all-important Alt-Neu stage. No talk of holy mountains and tsunamis and winds without relating it in an informed way to the authors who composed the story. If your paper doesn't do that, then the day is young and it's not too late to tweak a little. Writing is rewriting. Address this by the end of the conference and the drinks are on me. Why are we here? Why this second conference on the Exodus? Because it all starts with the Exodus, not with creation, not with the flood, not even with Abraham. It all starts with a group of aliens, attached outsiders, or as you say that in Hebrew, Leviim, in Egypt, and the nation and the book that were born when those Leviim merged with the residents of Israel. The Exodus thus led to the doctrine of loving the alien. The first occurrence of the word Torah in the book of Exodus says, "You shall have one Torah for the citizen and for the alien." That rule occurs 52 times in the Torah. It can be a source of strength and of wisdom in our chaotic times, but not if we scholars who are entrusted with the continual unveiling and rediscovery of the Bible go about in tohu vavohu instead of cooperation and mutual recognition. This is about the Exodus and about something much bigger than the Exodus. The Bible, for all its difficulties that we of all people are in the business of confronting, is still a valuable guide, a spiritual gyroscope to help us with our balance. Let us leave this conference at its end, our Exodus, continuing our commitment to bringing this new understanding about this old book to the world.